Jiho Park stood in the massive selection hall of the Galactic Survival Institute, looking around at the strangest group of beings he had ever seen. The hall was huge, with walls made of some kind of glowing metal that seemed to pulse with energy. Above them, holographic displays showed images of frozen planets and survival statistics that made his stomach turn. The human engineer from Seoul was not the tallest person in the room. At 28 years old, he had spent most of his life working on heating systems for buildings in cold places. His black hair was cut short, and he wore simple clothes that looked very plain next to the colorful outfits of the other candidates. Next to him stood a being that looked like it was made of living crystal. The Vethani called itself Kethmore, and every time it moved, tiny lights sparkled inside its transparent body. The creature was twice as tall as Jiho and made soft ringing sounds when it walked. It had told everyone that its people lived on planets covered in ice, so this test would be easy. On the other side of the room, a Krell named Bluebash was sitting in a special tank filled with purple liquid. The creature looked like a giant frog, with 4 arms and skin that changed colors. Bluebash kept bragging about how its people could slow down their hearts and sleep through long winters. The tank made bubbling sounds as the creature breathed through special tubes. The Zeph representative scared Jiho the most. Buzzek looked like a giant insect with sharp claws and wings that never stopped moving. Its eyes were huge and black, and it made clicking sounds when it talked. The Zeph claimed their hard shell could protect them from any cold, and they could eat almost anything to stay alive. Near the center of the hall floated a cloud of green gas that sparkled with tiny lights. This was Wispara, the Nextar delegate. The gas cloud could change shape and sometimes formed what looked like a face to talk to others. Wispara said that beings made of gas did not need solid food or water, making survival much easier for them. The Corvin named Clank Iron looked like a robot, but Jiho knew it was a living being made of metal. Its body was silver and gold, with gears and pipes visible through transparent panels. Steam came out of small holes in its arms and legs. Clank Iron kept saying that metal beings could not freeze and did not need to eat like other creatures. The strangest one was Root Whisper, a xylem that looked like a walking tree. Its body was made of thick brown bark, with green leaves growing from its arms and head. Tiny flowers bloomed and died on its skin as it moved. Root Whisper claimed that plant-based beings could make their own food from light and could survive by growing thick bark for protection. Director Vashek, a tall alien with purple skin and 3 eyes, walked to the center of the hall. The director's voice was deep and echoed off the walls as it spoke to the group. Welcome, candidates from across the galaxy. You have been chosen to take part in the most difficult survival test we have ever created. Each of your species believes they are the best at staying alive in harsh conditions. Today we will find out who is right. The director waved one of its long arms, and the wall behind it became transparent. Through it, they could see a planet that looked like a giant ball of white and blue ice. Lightning flashed through thick clouds, and even from space, the planet looked deadly and cold. This is Kepler 442c, which we call frozen hell. The temperature on this planet drops to negative 180 degrees during its 40-hour nights. The air is mostly nitrogen with traces of methane. The ground is covered with ice so hard it can cut through metal. Storms with winds over 200 miles per hour happen every few hours. Jiho felt his mouth go dry as he listened. He had worked in cold places before, but nothing like this. The other candidates, however, seemed excited rather than worried. Kethmore's crystal body rang like a bell as it laughed. Our people have lived in places colder than this for thousands of years. Ice and crystal are the same to us. Blubash made gurgling sounds of agreement from its tank. My species can slow our body functions until we barely need any heat at all. We can wait out any storm. Buzzek clicked its claws together. Our shells are harder than any ice. Cold cannot hurt us. The director raised its hand for silence. Each of you will be given the same supplies. 1 emergency food pack with enough food for 5 days. 1 power cell that can run a small device for 48 hours. 1 set of basic tools including a knife, rope, and a small shovel. 1 emergency beacon that will call for rescue if you activate it. Using these items and anything you can find on the planet, you must survive for 7 days. 7 days? Whisparas. Gas form swirled nervously. That seems very long for such a cold place. The test is designed to push each species to their limits, the director replied. We want to see not just who can survive, but who can do more than just survive. The winner will help create new survival training programs for space explorers from their species. Jiho raised his hand slowly. All the other beings turned to look at him, and he suddenly felt very small. Yes, human? The director asked. Will we be able to communicate with each other during the test? Each candidate will have a short-range communicator. You may talk to others, but remember, this is not a team event. Only 1 winner will be chosen. Ankiron's eye. Metal body made grinding sounds as it moved. Humans are new to space travel. Do you really think you belong in this competition? Your species has soft skin and weak bones. You cannot even survive on your own planet without clothes and tools. Several of the other candidates made sounds that Jiho guessed were laughter. He felt his face get warm, but he tried to stay calm. Maybe that is why I am here, Jiho said quietly. Because we have learned to use tools and clothes to survive in places we were not born for. Root Whisper's leaves rustled with what sounded like amusement. Tools will not help you when your blood freezes in your veins, soft creature. The director clapped its hands together, making a sound like thunder. Enough talk. You will be transported to frozen hell in 1 hour. Use this time to prepare yourselves mentally. Remember, this test will show the galaxy which species truly deserves to be called the greatest survivors. As the candidates began to spread out around the hall, Jiho walked to a quiet corner and sat down on a metal bench. He closed his eyes and thought about all the cold places he had worked in back on Earth. Antarctica, the Arctic research stations, the high mountains where people needed special heating systems just to stay alive. He had never been on a planet, like frozen hell, but he knew something the others did not seem to understand. Surviving in extreme cold was not about being naturally tough or having special body parts. It was about understanding heat, knowing how to keep it, make it, and use it wisely. While the other candidates boasted about their natural abilities, Jiho began planning. He thought about insulation, heat transfer, and energy conservation. He remembered lessons from old survival books and stories from explorers who had survived impossible situations. When the transport ship was ready, Jiho felt nervous, but also excited. This would be the hardest test of his life. But it was also a chance to show that humans could do more than just survive. They could adapt, learn, and find ways to make even the most dangerous places livable. The real test was about to begin. The transport ship shook as it entered the atmosphere of frozen hell. Through the small window next to his seat, Jiho could see thick white clouds rushing past. Lightning flashed between the clouds, casting strange blue and purple shadows inside. The ship, The temperature display on the wall showed the outside air getting colder by the minute. "Drop zone approaching," announced the ship's computer in a voice that sounded like singing metal. "All candidates prepare for individual deployment." Ji-Ho checked his survival pack one more time. The emergency food consisted of small silver bars. That tasted like cardboard, but contained all the nutrients a human needed. The power cell was about the size of his fist and hummed softly when he touched it. His tools were simple but well made. A sharp knife with a strong handle, 50 feet of thin rope, and a small folding shovel. The emergency beacon worried him the most. It was bright red and had a single button on top. Once he pressed it, rescue, ships would come for him, but he would also be out of the competition. He hoped he would never need to use it. "First drop. Vethani candidate," the computer announced. Kethmore stood up, its crystal body ringing like wind chimes. The creature looked completely calm as it walked to the drop pod. "See you on the surface, soft ones. Try not to freeze before I can claim my victory." The pod door closed, and a few seconds later, they heard it launch with a whooshing sound. One by one, the other candidates were dropped at different locations across the test zone. Blubbash went next, still sitting in its mobile tank. Buzzek clicked its claws excitedly before disappearing into its pod. Whispera swirled into a tight ball of gas before being dropped. Clank Iron marched into its pod like a soldier going to war. Root Whisper whispered something in its plant language before its pod launched. Finally, only Ji-Ho was left. Final candidate, human. Drop Zone 7. "Good luck, Ji-Ho Park," the computer said, and for a moment it almost sounded like it meant it. The drop pod was cramped and smelled like metal and cleaning chemicals. Ji-Ho strapped himself in and held his survival pack tightly as the pod door sealed shut. His stomach dropped as the pod was launched from the ship. The ride down was rough and scary. The pod spun and bounced as it fell through the stormy atmosphere. Through a small screen, Ji-Ho watched the ground getting closer. A landscape of white ice, gray rocks, and dark cracks that looked like wounds in the planet's surface. The pod hit the ground hard, throwing Ji-Ho against his straps. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of wind howling outside. Then the pod door opened with a hiss, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. Ji-Ho had never felt anything like it. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and his exposed skin began to sting immediately. He quickly pulled on the thin emergency suit that came with his pack, but it was designed for short-term protection only. He could already feel the cold creeping through the fabric. Stepping out of the pod, Ji-Ho found himself standing on a plain of ice that stretched to the horizon in all directions. The ice was not smooth. It was covered with ridges and cracks and strange crystal formations that looked like frozen trees. The sky was dark gray, with clouds moving fast overhead. His communicator crackled to life. "This is Kethmore. I have landed safely and am beginning construction of my shelter. The cold here is nothing compared to my homeworld. Blubbash reporting," came a gurgling voice. "I have found a depression in the ice where I can create a proper hibernation chamber." Other voices chimed in as the candidates reported their locations and plans. Buzzek had found a cave in a rock formation. Whispara was looking for a place where wind could not scatter its gas form. Clank Iron announced it was going to dig into the ground to escape the wind. Root Whisper said it was going to grow thick bark and wait for better weather. Ji-Ho looked around his landing site more carefully. He was in a small valley between two ice ridges, which would give him some protection from the wind. About 100 yards away, he could see the metal remains of an old weather station, probably left by previous research expeditions. Most importantly, he noticed something the others had not mentioned in their reports. The ice here was not all the same. Some areas were clear and hard, some were white and looked softer, and some had a blue tint that suggested different chemical compositions. There were also dark spots in the ice where organic materials had been frozen long ago. While the other candidates rushed to build shelters using their natural abilities, Jiho began to explore the area around his landing site. He used his knife to chip samples from different types of ice, examining them closely. He tested how hard they were, how they melted, and how they conducted heat. "Human candidate, what are you doing?" came Clank Iron's metallic voice over the communicator. "The temperature is dropping fast. Should you not be building shelter?" "I am preparing," Jiho replied simply. This made several of the candidates laugh. Buzzek's clicking laughter was particularly loud. "Preparing to freeze to death, maybe. We can see the temperature readings. It will be negative 100 degrees in 6 hours. Jiho ignored the laughter and continued his exploration. At the old weather station, he found several useful items that previous expedition teams had left behind. There were metal sheets, some electronic components that looked damaged but might have useful parts, and several containers that could hold water or other materials. Most interesting was a pile of equipment that looked like it had been damaged in a crash. There were insulation materials, metal tubes, and what looked like pieces of a heating system. Jiho began to examine each piece carefully, testing their condition and thinking about how they might be used. As he worked, he listened to the reports from other candidates on his communicator. Their confidence was starting to crack as the temperature continued to drop faster than expected. "The cold is affecting my joints," Clank Iron reported. "My metal parts are becoming brittle." "My leaves are beginning to frost," admitted Root Whisper. "I may need to shed them to conserve energy." "The ice here is harder than expected," said Keth Moore. "My crystal tools are having trouble cutting through it." Jiho continued to work methodically, sorting the materials he had found and planning his next steps. He used his small shovel to dig into different areas, testing the ground composition. In some places, the ground was solid ice. In others, there was dirt and rock underneath that could be excavated. The wind was getting stronger, and Jiho could feel the temperature dropping even through his emergency suit. His fingers were starting to get numb, making it harder to handle small objects. He knew he needed to start building his shelter soon, but he also knew that rushing would lead to mistakes he could not afford. Unlike the other candidates who were using their natural abilities to create shelters, Jiho was approaching the problem like an engineering challenge. He was not just trying to hide from the cold, he was planning to create a system that would generate and conserve heat. "First night approaches," announced the computer voice on all their communicators. "Temperature will reach minimum in approximately 4 hours. All candidates advised to secure shelters immediately." Around him, Jiho could hear the sounds of construction as the other candidates worked frantically to finish their shelters. Kethmore was using sonic vibrations to crack ice into building blocks. Blubbesh was making sloshing sounds as it prepared its hibernation chamber. Buzzek was clicking rapidly as it modified its cave. The others were making their own preparation sounds. Jiho picked up his sorted materials and began carrying them to the spot he had chosen for his shelter, a depression near the old weather station where he would be protected from wind, but still have access to the salvageable equipment. As he worked, he thought about all the cold weather survival stories he had read back on Earth. He remembered reading about explorers who had survived in the Arctic by understanding heat transfer, about engineers who had designed heating systems for space, stations, about the simple physics principles that could mean the difference between life and death in extreme cold. The real test was just beginning, and while the other candidates relied on their biology, Jiho was about to rely on human ingenuity and thousands of years of learning how to survive in places where humans were never meant to live. The temperature gauge on his communicator showed -60 degrees and dropping fast. Soon, the real challenge would begin. The temperature on frozen hell was dropping faster than anyone had expected. Jiho's communicator now showed -80 degrees, and the first night was still 3 hours away. The wind had gotten so strong that it howled like a living creature, and ice crystals in the air made it hard to see more than a few yards in any direction. Through his communicator, Jiho could hear that the other candidates were already struggling more than they had expected. "The cold is seeping through my crystal structure," Kethmore reported, its voice sounding less confident than before. "I am having to use more energy than planned to maintain my internal temperature." Jiho looked up from his work to see a faint glow in the distance where the Vethani had built its shelter. The crystal being was using its internal energy to create heat, making its body glow like a lamp, but Jiho could see that the glow was getting dimmer as time passed. "My tank insulation is not as effective as expected," came Bluebash's gurgling voice. "The purple fluid is starting to thicken from the cold. I may need to enter hibernation earlier than planned." From another direction, Jiho could hear the sound of rapid clicking. Buzzek was working frantically to seal the entrance to its cave, but the insect's movement seemed slower and more jerky than before. "Wind is scattering my form," Wispara reported, its voice sounding thin and stretched. "I am having to compress myself more tightly than is comfortable. This is using much energy." The most concerning report came from Clank Iron. The metal being's voice was starting to sound different, more mechanical and less alive. Joint movement becoming restricted. Metal components contracting beyond normal parameters. May need to shut down non-essential systems to conserve power. Only Root Whisper remained quiet, but Jiho could see a dim area in the distance where the plant being had taken shelter. No light, no movement, no sounds. The xylem had probably already gone into some kind of winter sleep mode. While listening to these reports, Jiho continued working on his own shelter. Unlike the others who had built simple protective barriers, Jiho was constructing something more complex. He had spent the last 2 hours creating what looked like a strange metal cocoon. The outer layer was made from metal sheets he had salvaged from the old weather station. These were arranged in a double wall with a gap between them. In this gap, Jiho had stuffed every piece of insulation material he could find, old fabric, damaged foam, and even some plant matter that had been frozen in the ice. But the real innovation was inside. Jiho had used his knife to carefully disassemble several electronic components from the salvaged equipment. From these, he had built a simple heat recovery system using metal tubes and wires from the power cell. The system worked on a basic principle he had learned while designing heating systems on Earth. Instead of just producing heat and letting it escape, his shelter would capture waste heat and recycle it. Warm air would flow through metal tubes that passed close to cold incoming air, transferring heat and warming the fresh air before it entered his living space. As he worked, Jiho's hands were getting very cold even inside his thin gloves. His emergency suit was not designed for this level of cold, and he could feel the temperature getting dangerous for human survival. But he forced himself to work carefully and methodically. One mistake now could kill him. Human, Your silence is concerning, came Kethmore's voice. Are you still alive over there? I am working, Jiho replied, his breath forming clouds of ice crystals as he spoke. Working on what? Asked Buzzek, its clicking voice sounding strained. We can barely see any shelter where you are. Have you given up and decided to freeze quietly? Several of the other candidates made sounds that might have been laughter, but they sounded more nervous than amused now. I am not building a shelter, Jiho said as he connected the last tube in his heat recovery system. I am building a thermal management system. A what? Asked Blubash. Instead of explaining, Jiho crawled inside his metal cocoon and sealed the entrance behind him. The inside was cramped, just big enough for him to sit or lie down. But immediately he felt the difference. The howling wind became a distant sound, and the metal walls blocked the worst of the cold. But more importantly, his heat recovery system was starting to work. As his body heat warmed the small space, the metal tubes captured that heat and used it to warm the small amount of fresh air that entered the shelter. Within minutes, the temperature inside had risen to -20 degrees. Still very cold, but survivable for a human with proper clothing. Jiho activated his power cell and connected it to a small heating element he had built from salvaged electronic parts. The heating element was tiny and used very little power, but in the small, well-insulated space, it made a significant difference. Outside, the wind was getting even stronger and the temperature was still dropping. Through his communicator, he could hear that the other candidates were in serious trouble. Crystal structure beginning to crack from thermal stress, Kethmore reported, its voice now full of strain. Internal energy reserves dropping faster than expected. Hibernation fluid nearly frozen solid, Blubash gurgled weakly. Entering emergency deep sleep mode now. The clicking from Buzzek had slowed to an occasional tick. Shell integrity compromised, cold penetrating exoskeleton, mobility severely reduced. Wispara's voice was barely audible. Form cohesion failing. Cannot maintain consciousness much longer. Clank Iron's report was the most alarming. Primary systems shutting down to prevent permanent damage. Entering survival mode. May not be able to communicate further. From Root Whisper, there was only silence. Jiho felt a pang of concern for his fellow candidates, but he also felt something else. Pride in human engineering. While the aliens had relied on their natural biology, he had used tools, knowledge, and careful planning to create a solution that was actually working. Inside his thermal capsule, Jiho was not just surviving. He was comfortable enough to think clearly and plan his next moves. He pulled out one of his emergency food bars and ate it slowly, washing it down with water he had melted using his small heating element. The food tasted terrible, but it was warm, and that made all the difference. As he ate, he listened to the storm outside and thought about what he would do when morning came. His power cell would last for about 48 hours total, but he was using it very efficiently. With his heat recovery system, he might be able to stretch it even longer. More importantly, he had ideas for improvements. There were more materials at the old weather station that he had not had time to collect. If he could salvage more metal and insulation, he could expand his thermal capsule or even build a secondary system. He also remembered seeing what looked like organic matter frozen in some of the ice formations. If he could safely extract and burn some of this material, he might be able to create a more permanent heat source that did not depend on his power cell. "This is Jiho," he said into his communicator. "I am secure and maintaining positive internal temperature. How is everyone else doing?" The responses were weak and concerning. Most of the candidates were barely conscious, and some had stopped responding entirely. The first night of the test had not even reached its coldest point yet, and already most of the superior species were failing. Jiho settled back in his warm cocoon and began planning improvements for tomorrow. Outside, the storm raged, and the temperature continued to drop toward the deadly minimum of negative 180 degrees. But inside his human-engineered thermal management system, Jiho was warm enough to start thinking about his next innovation. He had survived the first challenge, and now he was beginning to understand something important. This test was not about who had the toughest biology or the most natural cold resistance. It was about who could adapt, innovate, and find solutions to problems that biology alone could not solve. And in that kind of test, humans had thousands of years of experience that the aliens were only beginning to understand. The real competition was just getting started, and for the first time since landing on frozen hell, Jiho felt confident that he could not only survive, but thrive. Dawn on frozen hell was not like dawn on Earth. Instead of a warm sun rising over the horizon, there was only a gradual lightening of the dark gray sky as the planet's distant star provided just enough light to see by. The temperature had bottomed, out at negative 190 degrees during the night, even colder than predicted. Inside his thermal capsule, Jiho had slept surprisingly well. His heat recovery system had worked through the night, keeping the internal temperature at a survivable negative 10 degrees. His small heating element had used only a fraction of his power cell's energy, and he still had more than 36 hours of power remaining. When he activated his communicator, the silence was alarming. "This is Jiho calling all candidates. Please, report your status." For several minutes there was no response. Then weakly came Kethmore's voice. "Crystal structure. Damaged, but alive. Internal heat generation nearly exhausted. May not survive another night like that." Blubash's response was even weaker. "Hibernation fluid partially frozen. Systems operating at minimal levels. Tank heating failed during night." From Buzzek came only occasional clicking sounds, too weak to form words. Wispara managed a few. Words. "Form barely stable. Cannot maintain normal density. Consciousness fading." Clank Iron's voice was completely mechanical now. "Emergency protocols active. Core temperature critical. Manual override required to restore normal function." Root Whisper remained silent. Jiho felt genuinely worried for his fellow candidates. While he had been warm and comfortable, they had barely survived the first night. Some might not survive another night without help, but first, he had work to do. Jiho carefully opened his shelter and stepped outside into the morning air. Even with the temperature risen to negative 100 degrees, the cold hit him like a wall. But his emergency suit had dried out overnight in his warm shelter, and the insulation was working much better now. The landscape around him looked different in the dim morning light. The storm had deposited new ice formations, and some of the crystal structures had changed shape from the extreme cold. Most importantly, Jiho could see areas where the wind had exposed new materials that had been buried before. He spent the first hour of daylight collecting these new materials. There were more metal pieces, possibly from old research equipment or crashed ships. He found several types of plastic and ceramic materials that could be useful for insulation. Most excitingly, he discovered a deposit of what looked like frozen, organic matter, possibly plant material from the planet's warmer past. Back at his shelter, Jiho began the next phase of his engineering project. Using his knife and the tools from his survival pack, he carefully expanded his thermal capsule. The new materials allowed him to create a second chamber connected to the first by an insulated tunnel. This second chamber would serve as his workshop and materials storage area. More importantly, it would house his next innovation, a more efficient heating system that did not depend entirely on his power cell. Using metal tubes and sheets from his salvaged materials, Jiho constructed what engineers call a thermal mass heater. The concept was simple. Use a small amount of fuel to heat up a large mass of metal, then let that mass slowly release heat over many hours. The challenge was fuel. Jiho carefully examined the frozen organic matter he had found. Some of it looked like it might burn, but he would need to be very careful about ventilation in his sealed shelter. Carbon monoxide poisoning would kill him just as surely as freezing. Working slowly and methodically, Jiho built a small combustion chamber with careful airflow controls. He used metal tubes to create a flue system that would carry dangerous gases outside while recovering as much heat as possible from the exhaust. By midday, he had his new heating system ready for testing. He started with a very small piece of the organic fuel, watching carefully for any signs of problems. The material burned slowly and produced a surprising amount of heat. Even better, his thermal mass system captured most of that heat and began radiating warmth into his shelter. With his improved heating system working, Jiho turned his attention to another problem: water. His emergency supplies included water, purification tablets, but he needed a reliable source of liquid water. Melting ice with his heating elements was possible but used too much power. The solution came from another engineering principle: solar heating. Even though Frozen Hell's sun was weak, it was still a source of energy. Jiho used dark metal sheets to create a simple solar collector. By focusing even the weak sunlight and using it to melt small amounts of ice, he could produce water without using his precious electrical power. As he worked on these improvements, Jiho continued monitoring his communicator. The reports from other candidates were getting more concerning. Crystal body continuing to deteriorate, Kethmore reported weakly. Losing structural integrity. May need to trigger emergency beacon. Tank systems failing, Blubash gurgled. Hibernation. Fluid contaminated with ice crystals. Biological functions compromised. Buzzek had stopped making any coherent sounds at all. Wispara's voice was barely a whisper. Cannot hold form together much longer. Gas dispersion accelerating. Clank Iron's emergency protocols were apparently preventing it from communicating at all now. Still nothing from Root Whisper. Looking at his own thriving situation, Jiho felt a responsibility to help. But he also knew that revealing too much about his methods might put him at a disadvantage in the competition. After thinking about it for several minutes, he made a decision. This is Jiho to all candidates. I have successfully created a stable heating system and am maintaining positive internal temperatures. If anyone needs assistance, I may be able to provide advice or emergency help. The response was immediate and desperate. How? Kethmore asked. How are you maintaining heat? Your species has no natural cold resistance. Engineering, Jiho replied simply. I am not trying to resist the cold with my body. I am using tools and knowledge to create warm environments. What kind of tools? Blubash asked. We all have the same basic supplies. Jiho looked around his expanded shelter with its heat recovery system, thermal mass heater, solar collector, and carefully managed airflow. I am using salvaged materials and applying heat transfer principles. The key is not to generate heat, but to capture it, store it, and use it efficiently. Over the next hour, Jiho provided basic advice to those candidates who were still conscious enough to listen. He explained how to create insulation layers, how to minimize heat loss through radiation and convection, and how to use thermal mass to store heat. Some of the candidates were able to implement his suggestions and improve their situations slightly. Others were too weakened or too trapped in their failing shelters to make changes. As afternoon turned to evening and the temperature began dropping again, Jiho made final preparations for the second night. His expanded shelter was now a sophisticated thermal management system that could maintain comfortable temperatures with minimal energy input. He had food, water, heat, and shelter. More than that, he had a system that was actually improving over time as he refined and upgraded it. But most importantly, he had demonstrated something that the Galactic Survival Institute had not expected. Human survival was not about being naturally tough or biologically adapted to harsh conditions. It was about using intelligence, knowledge, and tools to change the environment rather than just enduring it. As the second night approached and temperatures began their deadly plunge, again Jiho settled into his warm, well-engineered shelter. Outside, the other candidates prepared for what might be their last night on frozen hell. But inside his human-built thermal sanctuary, Jiho was already planning tomorrow's improvements. He had an idea for a more advanced heating system, and he thought he might have found materials to build a small greenhouse where he could start growing emergency food. The test had been designed to find the galaxy's best survivors. But it was starting to look like the real test was not about surviving. It was about learning to thrive in conditions where survival should be impossible. And in that test, human engineering was proving superior to any biological adaptation the galaxy had ever seen. By the second day on frozen hell, Jiho's thermal capsule had evolved into something that would have impressed engineers back on Earth. The system now maintained a steady internal temperature of positive 15 degrees Celsius, warm enough that he could remove his emergency suit and work in just his regular clothes. His thermal mass heater was working so efficiently that he only needed to add fuel twice a day. The heat recovery system was capturing nearly all the waste heat from his breathing and body, recycling it back through the shelter. His solar collector was producing enough melted water for drinking, cleaning, and even some extra for future projects. But it was what Jiho did next that shocked everyone monitoring the test. He decided to make tea from his personal gear, items he was allowed to bring from Earth. Jiho had packed a small container of dried tea leaves and a metal cup. These were not survival necessities, just comfort items that reminded him of home. Now, as he sat comfortably in his warm shelter listening to the storm outside, he thought it was time for a proper tea break. Using his heating system, Jiho boiled water in his metal cup. The water heated quickly and cleanly, with no waste of precious energy. He added a pinch of the dried leaves and let them steep, filling his shelter with a wonderful aroma that reminded him of quiet mornings in Seoul. "This is Jiho reporting," he said into his communicator as he sipped the hot tea. "Day 2, evening. Internal temperature holding steady at 15 degrees Celsius. All systems functioning normally. Currently enjoying a hot beverage." The silence that followed lasted for several seconds. "Did you just say, hot beverage?" Kethmore's voice was weak but amazed. "Yes, tea, specifically. Would anyone like to hear how to build a thermal mass heating system? I have time to explain, while I finish my drink." The response from the monitoring station was immediate. Director Vashek's voice cut into their communication channel. "Human candidate, please confirm your reported internal temperature. Did you say positive 15 degrees? "That is correct," Jiho replied, taking another sip of tea. 15 degrees Celsius above freezing. My shelter is quite comfortable now." There was a long pause before the director responded. Please activate your external camera so we can verify this report. Jiho activated the small camera built into his communicator and pointed it around his shelter. The camera showed his expanded thermal capsule with its sophisticated heating systems, insulation, layers, and the steam rising from his cup of tea. The reaction from the other candidates was immediate and desperate. "How is this possible?" Kethmore asked. "I am barely maintaining structural integrity at -60 degrees, and you are drinking hot tea?" "Please," Blubash begged weakly. "Share your method. My tank systems have completely failed. I may not survive another hour." Jiho set down his tea and considered the situation. His fellow candidates were dying while he was comfortable enough to enjoy luxury beverages. The competitive part of him said to keep his advantages secret, but the human part of him could not ignore their suffering. "I will share what I know," he decided. "But you must understand, what I have built takes time and specific materials. You may not be able to implement everything immediately." Over the next hour, as Jiho slowly sipped his tea, he provided detailed instructions on building thermal management systems. He explained heat transfer principles, insulation techniques, and thermal mass storage. He described how to salvage materials and repurpose electronics for heating elements. Most importantly, he explained the mindset behind his approach. "You are all trying to endure the cold with your bodies," Jiho told them. "But that is not how humans survive in places we do not belong. We change the environment to suit us, rather than changing ourselves to suit the environment." "But how did you know to do this?" Wispara asked, its voice barely audible. "These techniques, where did you learn them?" Jiho refilled his cup with more hot water and added fresh tea leaves. "From necessity. Humans evolved in warm places, but we wanted to live everywhere. So for thousands of years, we have been learning to create warm spaces in cold places. We learned to make fire, to build insulated shelters, to store heat and conserve energy." "You mean your entire species has been preparing for this test?" Buzzek managed to click weakly. "In a way, yes," Jiho replied. "Every human who ever survived. A winter. Every engineer who designed a heating system, every explorer who survived in the Arctic. They all contributed to the knowledge I am using now." As he talked, Jiho continued working on his next project. Using more salvaged materials, he was building what he called a thermal buffer system, a way to store excess heat during the day when his solar collector was working and release it slowly during the coldest part of the night. The work was intricate and required careful attention to detail, but Jiho's hands were warm and steady in his heated shelter. He could take his time, think through each step, and build something that would work reliably. Meanwhile, the reports from other candidates showed they were getting more desperate by the hour. "Crystal structure cracking badly," Kethmore reported. "Internal light fading. May have to trigger emergency beacon within hours." "Hibernation systems completely failed," Blubash gurgled. "Core temperature dropping below survival minimum." Buzzek had stopped responding entirely. Wispara was barely maintaining enough coherence to communicate. "Form dispersing, cannot concentrate. Gas molecules much longer." Clank Iron remained in emergency shutdown mode. Root Whisper had been silent for over a day. "Director Vashek," Jiho said into his communicator, "I recommend immediate medical evaluation for all non-human candidates. Several appear to be approaching life-threatening conditions." "Rescue teams are on standby," the director replied, "but the test parameters require that candidates trigger their own emergency beacons to receive assistance." Jiho finished his second cup of tea and set the cup aside carefully. Then I am requesting permission to provide direct assistance to candidates who need it. That is against test protocols, the director said. This is an individual survival challenge. The test was designed to determine which species are the best survivors, Jiho replied. But survival is not just about staying alive yourself. Human survival has always included helping others survive too. If you want to see true human survival behavior, you need to let me help them. There was a long silence from the monitoring station. Finally, Director Vashek spoke again. Human candidate, you are requesting permission to risk your own successful test performance to provide aid to competitors? I am requesting permission to demonstrate how humans actually survive, Jiho corrected. We survive together, not alone. Another pause. Permission granted, but understand that any assistance you provide may be used to evaluate your competitors' final scores. Jiho was already putting his emergency suit back on and gathering supplies. Understood. I'm going to help Blubash first. The Krell is closest and in the most immediate danger. As he prepared to leave his warm, comfortable shelter and venture into the deadly cold of frozen hell, Jiho reflected on what this test had really shown. The other species had superior biology for cold survival, but they had approached the challenge as individuals trying to endure harsh conditions. Humans survived differently. They used tools, knowledge, and most importantly, they helped each other. The tea ceremony had not been a luxury. It had been a demonstration of how successfully humans could adapt to any environment. Now it was time to show the galaxy what human survival really looked like when it included the most human trait of all, compassion for others in need. Jiho sealed his shelter carefully to preserve the heat, picked up his emergency medical kit and some hot water in an insulated container, and stepped out into the howling storm to save his competitors. The real test of human survival was just beginning. The journey to Blubash's location was the most dangerous thing Jiho had done since landing on frozen hell. Outside his shelter, the temperature was negative 120 degrees, and the wind was strong enough to knock him down if he was not careful. Ice crystals in the air made it almost impossible to see, and every breath felt like needles in his lungs. But Jiho had prepared for this. He wore multiple layers under his emergency suit, with his own body heat being supplemented by small heating pads he had made from his power cell, and some salvaged electronics. He carried an insulated container of hot water and medical supplies in a pack designed to preserve their temperature. Most importantly, he carried a portable heater, a small device he had built using principles from his larger thermal mass system. It was not powerful enough to heat a large space, but it could warm a person or keep medical supplies from freezing. Following the coordinates from his communicator, Jiho found Blubash's shelter in a depression about 400 meters from his own camp. What he found there shocked him. The Krell's mobile tank had completely frozen solid. Through the transparent walls, Jiho could see Blubash motionless inside, surrounded by what had once been purple liquid, but was now solid ice. The creature's skin had turned a pale blue color, and it was not moving at all. Jiho quickly set up his portable heater next to the tank and began the delicate process of thawing the frozen liquid. He could not heat it too quickly, or the rapid temperature change might kill Blubash. But he also could not take too long, or the creature would die from the cold. As the ice slowly began to melt around the edges of the tank, Jiho used his communicator to contact the monitoring station. This is Jiho. Blubash is in critical condition. The Krell appears to be in some kind of hibernation state, but its life support system has completely failed. I am attempting emergency warming, but this candidate needs immediate medical attention. Understood, came Director Vashek's voice. Rescue teams are standing by. Continue your assistance. It took nearly 2 hours of careful heating before enough of the liquid in the tank had melted for Blubbash to move. The Krell's first movements were weak and jerky, but gradually the creature began to show more signs of life. Blubbash, can you hear me? Jiho called through the tank's communication system. Cold, so cold, came the weak reply. Systems failed. Thought I was dying. You almost did, Jiho said. Your tank froze completely. I am warming the liquid now, but we need to get you to a safer location. Using his portable tools, Jiho was able to partially repair the tank's heating system. It would not work perfectly, but it would keep Blubbash alive long enough for rescue. Teams to arrive. Before leaving the Krell, Jiho set up a small shelter next to the tank and left one of his emergency heating pads to help maintain the temperature. I am going to check on the others, he told Blubbash. Try to stay conscious and keep your body moving to generate heat. The next stop was Kethmore's location. The Vethani had built an impressive crystal shelter, but when Jiho arrived, he found cracks running through the walls like spider webs. Inside, the crystal being was dim and barely glowing. Kethmore, this is Jiho. I am here to help. Human? The crystal being's voice was weak and distorted. How are you outside in this cold? Thermal management, Jiho replied, setting up his portable heater. Your crystal structure is cracked from thermal stress. We need to warm you slowly to prevent further damage. Working carefully, Jiho used his heater and hot water to gradually warm the air inside the crystal shelter. As the temperature rose, the stress cracks in Kethmore's body stopped expanding, though the damage that had already occurred was permanent. My people will be very interested in your heating techniques, Kethmore said as its internal glow began to strengthen slightly. I will be happy to share the knowledge, Jiho replied. But right now, you need to focus on staying alive until rescue arrives. The situation with Buzzek was even more critical. Jiho found the insect-like being curled. In a ball at the back of its cave, its hard shell covered with frost and its movements reduced to occasional twitches. The cold had penetrated even the Zeph's supposedly protective exoskeleton. Buzzek, can you hear me? The response was barely audible clicking. Jiho set up his largest heating pad and carefully wrapped it around the insect's body. He used hot water to melt the frost from Buzzek's shell and gradually began warming the creature's vital areas. As heat returned to its body, Buzzek began moving more normally. Thought shell would protect was wrong. Insulation only works if it traps air, Jiho explained. Your shell is good armor, but it conducts cold too efficiently. You needed internal heating, not just external protection. Wispara presented a completely different challenge. Jiho found the gas-based being compressed into a small, almost solid mass near some rock formations. The extreme cold had forced Wispara to condense so much that it was barely maintaining its gaseous state. This is going to be tricky, Jiho muttered, setting up a very gentle heating system around the condensed alien. Too much heat and you will expand too quickly. Too little, and you will freeze solid. Working very slowly and carefully, Jiho used his smallest heating element to gradually warm the area around Wispara. As the temperature rose degree by degree, the alien began to expand back toward its normal gaseous form. How did you survive? When we could not? Wispara asked weakly as it regained coherence. Different approach. Jiho replied. You all tried to survive with your bodies. I changed the environment instead. The most concerning case was Clank Iron. The metallic being had shut down completely and was covered with a layer of ice that made it look like a frozen statue. Its emergency protocols had saved its life by shutting down all non-essential systems, but it could not restart without external help. Jiho connected his portable power source to Clank Iron's emergency restart system and began the warming process. Metal needed to be heated very gradually to prevent cracking and warping. As heat flowed into its systems, Clank Iron began showing signs of life. Lights flickered on inside its transparent panels, and steam began rising from warming joints. System. Restart! Successful! Clank Iron announced in its mechanical voice. Core temperature rising to safe levels. Human assistance. Acknowledged and appreciated. Save your energy, Jiho advised. Your metal body loses heat very quickly in this environment. You will need continuous heating to survive until rescue. Finally, Jiho made his way to Root Whisper's location. The plant-like being had created a shelter among some rocks, but when Jiho arrived, he found what looked like a dead tree covered in ice. But as he set up his heater, Jiho noticed something interesting. Unlike the other candidates who were fighting, the cold Root Whisper seemed to have completely surrendered to it. The xylem had shed all its leaves and flowers and reduced itself to just the essential woody core. Root Whisper, can you hear me? For several minutes there was no response. Then slowly, a few small buds appeared on the alien's bark. Still, alive, came a whispered voice, waiting for warmth to return. It is returning now, Jiho said, adjusting his heater to provide steady, gentle heat. Your approach was actually quite smart. You went into full dormancy instead of trying to fight the cold. As warmth returned to the area, Root Whisper began showing more signs of life. Leaves started growing from its branches, and its bark began to show green patches underneath the frozen outer layer. By the time Jiho had visited all the candidates, he had been outside his shelter for over 8 hours. His emergency suit was nearly frozen solid. His heating pads were running low on power, and he was exhausted from fighting the cold. But all 6 of his fellow candidates were now stabilized and had improved chances of surviving until rescue teams could reach them. More importantly, each had learned something about thermal management that might help them in future survival situations. As Jiho made his way back to his own warm shelter, he reflected on what the rescue operations had taught him. The other species had superior biology for surviving cold, but they had no experience with engineering solutions to environmental problems. Humans, on the other hand, had spent millennia learning that survival was not just about individual endurance. It was about using tools, sharing knowledge, and helping others survive too. When he finally sealed himself back inside his thermal capsule and felt the wonderful warmth surround him again, Jiho realized that this test had revealed something important about human survival that even he had not fully understood before. Humans did not survive by being the toughest or the strongest. They survived by being the most adaptable, the most innovative, and most importantly, the most willing to help others. Survive along with them. The tea he brewed to warm himself after the rescue operations tasted better than any he had ever had before. The rescue operations were unlike anything the Galactic Survival Institute had ever witnessed. From the orbital monitoring station, Director Vashek and a team of survival experts from dozens of species watched as emergency teams landed on Frozen, hell to extract the failing candidates. One by one, the rescue ships arrived at the locations where the alien candidates had built their shelters. Medical teams found beings who had pushed their biological limits to the breaking point, some barely clinging to life despite having natural adaptations that should have made them superior survivors in cold environments. But the real shock came when the rescue team arrived at Jiho's location. "Rescue Team 7 to command," came the voice of the team leader, a member of the cold-adapted Cryon species. "We have arrived at the human candidate's coordinates. Please confirm these are correct." Director Vashek checked the tracking data. "Coordinates confirmed. You should find the human's emergency shelter at your current location." There was a long pause before the rescue team leader responded. "Command, we are not finding an emergency shelter. We are finding what appears to be a sophisticated research station." Through the video feed from the rescue team, the monitoring station staff could see what the rescuers were seeing. Instead of a desperate survivor huddled in a makeshift shelter, they found an extensive complex of interconnected thermal capsules, heating systems, and even what looked like a small greenhouse made from salvaged materials. "This is Jiho Park," came the human's voice over the communication system. "Welcome to my temporary base. Please come inside where it is warm." The rescue team entered through an airlock system that Jiho had constructed to prevent heat loss. Inside, they found the human sitting comfortably in shirt sleeves, sipping tea and reading from a notebook where he had been documenting his survival techniques. The temperature inside was a comfortable 20 degrees Celsius. The air was fresh and clean, circulated by fans that Jiho had built from salvaged electronics. There was a small kitchen area where he had been preparing meals using food he had grown in his improvised greenhouse. Most amazingly, there was enough space for several people to live comfortably. "How long have you been building this?" asked the rescue team leader, looking around in amazement. "Since I landed," Jiho replied. "I have been improving and expanding the system each day. By now it is quite efficient." "Sir," the team leader called back to command, "the human candidate does not require rescue. He has created a fully functional habitat that could support multiple individuals indefinitely." "Director," Vashek stared at the video feed in disbelief. "Are you saying the human has not just survived, but created a permanent settlement?" "That appears to be correct, sir. He is also requesting permission to provide hot meals and medical support for the candidates we have just rescued." In the days that followed, as the rescued candidates recovered in the medical facilities of the orbital station, word of what had happened on Frozen Hell spread throughout the galactic community. The species that had volunteered their best survival experts for the test were shocked to learn that not only had the human survived better than any of them, but he had done so while helping all the others. Kethmore, whose crystal structure was slowly healing under medical care, was the first to request a detailed interview with Jiho. "Your species is new to galactic civilization," the Vethani said. "Yet your survival techniques are more advanced than ours. How is this possible?" Jiho, who had been brought to the medical station after completing his full 7-day test period, thought about the question carefully. "I think it is because we had to learn these techniques to survive on our own planet," he explained. "Humans did not evolve to be naturally resistant to cold or heat or any other extreme environment. We are actually quite fragile compared to most of you." "Then how did you build such sophisticated systems?" asked Bluebash, speaking from a new, improved tank that incorporated some of Jiho's thermal management ideas. "Because being fragile forced us to become smart about survival," Jiho replied. "When we wanted to live in cold places, we could not just grow thicker skin or slow down our metabolism. We had to learn to make fire, build shelters, create heating systems. Every human who survived a winter contributed to the knowledge that I used on Frozen Hell." Buzzek, whose exoskeleton was slowly recovering from the thermal damage, clicked thoughtfully. So your entire species has been preparing for survival challenges for your whole history? In a way, yes, Jiho agreed. But more than that, we learned that survival is not something you do alone. The techniques I used were developed by thousands of humans over thousands of years, engineers who designed heating systems, explorers who survived in extreme environments, scientists who studied heat transfer. They all helped me survive on your planet. Director Vashek, who had come to interview Jiho personally, leaned forward with interest. But the test was designed to evaluate individual survival capabilities. You helped your competitors, which should have put you at a disadvantage. Jiho shook his head. That is where you misunderstand human survival. We do not survive as individuals. We survive as communities. Helping others survive makes all of us stronger. The knowledge I shared with them is now knowledge they can share with others. But surely there must have been a biological component, insisted Wispera, who was still recovering in a specialized containment unit. Your body must have some adaptation we did not detect. My body was probably the least adapted of any candidate, Jiho laughed. I was cold, tired, and hungry most of the time. But I had tools, knowledge, and experience that my biology could not provide. Clank Iron, whose systems had been upgraded with new thermal management protocols based on Jiho's designs, processed this information with visible confusion. This suggests that technological adaptation is superior to biological adaptation for survival. Not superior, Jiho corrected. Different. Your biological adaptations are amazing and allow you to do things humans cannot do. But human technological adaptation allows us to create solutions that work in any environment, not just the ones we evolved in. Root Whisper, who had regrown most of its leaves and was looking healthier than ever, rustled thoughtfully. And you share this technological adaptation with others, even competitors? Especially competitors, Jiho replied. Competition makes everyone better. If I had kept my knowledge secret, none of you would have learned anything from this test. But by sharing it, now all of your species have new survival techniques they can use in the future. The implications of what had happened during the survival test were slowly becoming clear to the galactic observers. The human had not just passed their test, he had revolutionized their understanding of what survival meant. Director Vashek made the formal announcement 3 days after the rescue operations concluded. The Galactic Survival Institute hereby declares that the human candidate, Jiho Park, has not only successfully completed the Frozen Hell survival test, but has achieved the highest survival rating in the history of our testing program. Furthermore, the techniques demonstrated during this test have applications that extend far beyond individual survival scenarios. What does this mean for the Institute's programs? Asked a reporter from the Galactic News Network. It means we have a lot to learn from human survival techniques, the director admitted. We are formally requesting that the human candidate establish the first multi-species survival training program with himself as the chief instructor. Jiho, who had been listening to the announcement from his temporary quarters, smiled as he sipped another cup of tea. This one properly brewed in a real kitchen with unlimited hot water. The test had been designed to find the galaxy's best individual survivor. Instead, it had revealed that the best survival strategy was not individual at all, but community-based, knowledge-sharing, and adaptable to any environment. And the species that had mastered that strategy was still relatively new to the galaxy, but had been practicing it for thousands of years on a small blue planet where survival had always required cooperation, innovation, and the willingness to help others thrive. The galaxy was about to learn a lot about human-style survival.